Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. And it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, practically, I'll talk about a comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is special. So last month was here at BookTube at War, which was a whole month devoted to reading fiction and nonfiction all about war. And so I had to make my comic book reading reflect that. So I read this. This is Enemy Ace, which was a fantastic war comic that began in the 1960s. It ran through the 1980s. It was kind of sporadic because this comic jumped around from book to book. Enemy Ace actually never had his own comic book in the initial run of Enemy Ace. He jumped around. What was he in? He started off in Army at War, then moved to Showcase Presents, then moved to Star Spangled War Stories. Then he went to Men of War, and eventually he ended up as a backup feature in The Unknown Soldier, which was another popular war comic book from the time. But this was one of the best. This was one of the best war comic books that not only DC ever did, but that anyone ever did. This was excellent. It was highly unusual because when this comic first came out in the 1960s, it was a risky venture because it was about an enemy ace. It was about Hans von Hammer, a German fighter pilot during the First World War. And it was a risky thing at the time to feature a comic book about a recurring character who was the enemy. Literally, he was Enemy Ace. He was a German fighter pilot fighting, the French and the English and the Americans. He was fighting us. So it was unique in that regard, and it was risky. But the comic was of such incredible high quality. It was so mature. It was so interesting. The artwork was so incredible and so dynamic that even with everything against it, it succeeded as a comic. The storytelling is fantastic. This was written by Robert Kanigher, who wrote all kinds of stuff. But this was certainly one of the best things that he ever did. The artwork is by Joe Kubert. Joe Kubert, who was an incredible comic book artist, who is known for a lot of different comics, probably mostly for Sergeant Rock, another war comic book that was also written by Kanigher. And he's also known for, Joe Kubert is, for Hawkman, and also for a fantastic run for Tarzan over at DC Comics. I mean, he was very accomplished, but I think probably, and this is a tough call, but I think his best work was on Enemy Ace. Because the artwork is just so dynamic and interesting and just so moody and well done. It was just great stuff, which you can see even here in this black and white reproduction. Unfortunately, I had to read this in black and white because, well, I've mentioned once or twice before how crappy DC Comics reprint program is. This is one of the greatest comic books DC Comics ever did. It's one of the best. This should be reproduced in a deluxe hardcover edition of some kind, an omnibus or some other deluxe edition, because this deserves it. Instead, this has only been reprinted a couple times. This is the last time it was reprinted in a book, in book form, and that was this cheap Showcase Presents volume, which the Showcase Presents volumes were all very cheap, printed in black and white. And before that, there were a couple archive editions came out about 30 years ago or something. And so you can get those, but they're a little pricey. DC Comics, man, you got to get it together and start reprinting some of your best stuff. If Marvel had this would have been reprinted a dozen times. But no, it's DC. So this is what we've got, unless you want to buy back issues. Which it would be worthwhile to do just because this is so darn good. Hans von Hammer, the Hammer of Hell, as he is known, is based on this guy, the Red Baron, who you might have heard of. He is very much based on the Red Baron, although the Red Baron unfortunately died young and in the war. He did not survive the war, as this character did, actually. But there were a lot of things that this took from the Red Baron, most notably the plane. And Hans von Hammer is the leader of a group of German pilots during World War I. This comic is excellent at showing some of the horrors of war and just what a waste of life war is. This really rams home just how wasteful it is. How every issue, it seems, probably every story, there are new young pilots that are just being massacred in the sky. And their lives are just wasted. For what? For war. And von Hammer hates war. But at the same time, he feels duty-bound to fight. He's a soldier. That's what he does. It's his duty to do what he's doing. And he's incredibly good at it. He's probably the best fighter pilot that ever existed. And he's really good at it, like I say. He feels free in the sky, but at the same time, he hates to kill, and that's his job. And his fellow pilots just think of him as an inhuman killing machine. So he's a lonely character. He is separated from everybody else, including his own pilots, just by what he is, which is, according to them, a killing machine. But he is very, very human. And this war, it takes its toll on him. And this comic is very clear about that. It's a very interesting character. He's a very dark and gloomy character, as you would imagine. But also, you can see that he has a good heart. And that if he was not fighting in a war, he would probably be a good person. But as it is, he's killing, he's killing people every single day because he's in this war. And he's, like I said, very, very good at what he does. And there are really interesting things about this book. One of the things, of course, is the artwork, which is just fantastic. Even in black and white, it's glorious. And the storytelling in this is just so good and so riveting. It's also interesting because of the way it presents von Hammer and other fighter pilots. They are on a different plane, literally, from the people fighting the war on the ground. And you will see the planes flying over no man's land. And they are above it all, the horrors that are going on below them. And you'll see you'll see bodies tangled up in barbed wire and all this other awfulness on the ground while the planes are flying way above them. And the sky is the last place where there is honor in war, which is one of the things that this series talks a lot about, is honor. Von Hammer has a very strong sense of honor, and a lot of other pilots did too. And when a pilot didn't, that was the exception, and they were really looked down upon. But it also makes clear that that was a privilege of being a fighter pilot in the sky in World War I, at least according to this. Because they had that luxury of honor, where ground troops didn't. It was just... It was just kill or be killed, and there are no rules in war, whereas there were rules in the sky. For example, if you were fighting somebody, if Von Hammer was fighting somebody, and they made it clear that they were out of ammunition, they would wave and say, I'm out of ammunition, and Von Hammer would just go on by. He wouldn't shoot you. Because it's dishonorable to fight an opponent who can't fight back. And so there's stuff like that going on. And when one pilot knocks down another, very often the pilot will salute the pilot that just shot him down because he's such a great pilot. I mean, there's stuff like that going on all the time. And it's really interesting. And the pilots will, they'll come down from the sky where they've been killing and could be killed at any second. And they'll just go home and have a drink, at the barracks, relax. All the time knowing that they have to go out again tomorrow and very possibly die. And Von Hammer is convinced through this whole series of stories that any moment he's going to die. He does not believe that he's going to survive the war. Nobody does. He does survive the war because he does show up in comic books after this series. He's such a great character that wisely he was brought back later. And they're just such gripping moments in this whole series. There are adversaries in this, but it's not like a superhero comic where your adversaries are villains or evil or something. Very clearly, his opponents in the sky are not evil, and they're not villains, and they're not arch foes, even though he has really interesting characters that he goes up against. One of the most interesting characters is the Hangman, who is this French pilot who flies around with a hood over his head and a noose around his neck. There's a great scene of the Hangman there. And the Hangman, he was disfigured by an earlier air fight with Von Hammer. But he doesn't hold that against Von Hammer because he knows it's just, it's just the way it is. Nevertheless, they are adversaries and they try to shoot each other and kill each other in the sky. However, there was a point when Von Hammer was shot down into the water, into a lake, and the Hangman went down and pulled him out and saved his life so he could fight again. I mean, that's the kind of stuff they do in this series. And there were some interesting adversaries. Because it's a comic book, you have characters like the Hangman. But all so well done. And they're... I mean, it's just great work. And this stuff should be reproduced, I'm telling you, in a high quality volume. Probably the most emotional point in this whole series is the tragic tale of Shotzi. Shotzi is this little puppy, and he's injured on the airfield. And Von Hammer picks him up and he bandages up his leg, and he decides that little Shotzi is his good luck charm. Von Hammer, like a lot of pilots, is superstitious. And, when you're doing what he does and one wrong move could kill you, that's not an unusual thing. And so he would take Shotzi up in his plane with him. And here you have a great scene with little Shotzi there with Von Hammer in the midst of this terrible battle. But because this is enemy ace, I mean, just look at that. That's awesome. Because this is enemy ace, it has to go horribly wrong. And there's this horrifying scene where Shotzi falls out of the plane. He falls out of the open cockpit of the plane, which, didn't see that one coming. But yeah, even the little dogs don't survive. And as Von Hammer himself says, it's always the innocent who die in war. I mean, it's just such a great series. It jumped around a lot, like I said, and so this made it a bit repetitive in the first few stories in this volume, for example, because it was moving from one comic to another comic to another, and every time it moved to a new comic, you don't know that the people who are reading it now read it before. So it did repeat some particular plot points. But once it got rolling and found a regular home for a while, then we got just some fantastic, fantastic stories. Eventually, Kubert moved on to other things, and this is some Howard Chaykin art there. Chaykin, as good as he is, I don't think he was at his best on this particular series, but that was followed by a John Severin run, which was just brilliant. Severin is such a great artist, and he's so good at war comics. And this comic book is just full of the details of the planes and all the stuff going on in the war. It was just so good. I mean, you can tell a lot of research went into the writing and illustrating of this comic book. Absolutely great stuff. Very memorable character. Really interesting character. Probably one of the most interesting and complex characters you'll find in comic books from the mid-1960s into the 1970s. It was good stuff. And I guess that's all I have to say about it. I'm hoping that eventually DC will get its act together, and one day we will get like a deluxe omnibus of this stuff so that everybody can read it. As it is right now, Enemy Ace can be a little hard to find. You either have to find the showcase volume or back issues or those old archive editions. But it's worth it. If you're intrigued by this character, reading this, it's rewarding. Even this showcase volume that's all in black and white, it's still riveting stuff. I mean, I read this whole thing in a couple of days, and it was fantastic. So, yeah, Enemy Ace. Great stuff. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.